The story begins, as many Soviet stories do, in a room with no windows. The exact location is not known. The exact date is disputed. What is known, or rather, what has been claimed, repeated, translated, embellished, and eventually indexed by search engines across the world, is the following. Sometime in the late 1940s, Soviet researchers sealed 5 political prisoners inside an airtight chamber and kept them awake for 30 days using an experimental stimulant gas. By the end of the experiment, the subjects had descended into madness, mutilated themselves, removed their own organs, and begged to be returned to the gas rather than be allowed to sleep. When the researchers finally opened the chamber, the subjects attacked them. The only way to stop them was to shoot them. The last survivor, strapped to an operating table, looked at the surgeon above him and said, "We are you. We are the part of you that you try to kill." This story does not exist in any declassified Soviet archive. It has no verifiable source. It originated in its modern form on a creative writing website in 2010, authored by an anonymous user posting under a horror fiction prompt. It spread because it was extraordinarily well written, because it tapped into genuine cultural anxieties about Soviet experimentation, and because the internet in 2010 was not yet well equipped to distinguish between documented history and well-crafted fiction. It is, by any rigorous standard, a fabrication, and yet it persists, is shared as fact, and continues to accumulate citations from people who found it on a website that cited the original fiction forum. The reason it persists is not stupidity. The reason it persists is that the story feels true in a way that maps onto things that actually happened. The Soviet Union did conduct experiments on human beings without their consent. The KGB did operate programs involving psychological manipulation, pharmacological testing, and the deliberate infliction of extreme psychological states on prisoners and unwilling subjects. The truth of Soviet human experimentation is not a story someone needed to invent. It was already there, in the archives, waiting for the classification stamps to come off. Sleep deprivation is one of the most profound and unsettling things the human body can experience, not because it is painful in the conventional sense, but because of what it does to the boundary between the self and reality. After 72 hours without sleep, the human brain begins to generate experiences that are indistinguishable from external reality. Sounds, voices, figures, sensations, produced entirely from within, perceived as entirely from without. The technical term is hypnagogic hallucination. The experiential term, used by people who have been through it, is simply, "I could not tell what was real." The military significance of this fact was not lost on either side of the Cold War. A combatant who cannot trust their own perceptions is not a combatant. A prisoner who cannot distinguish reality from hallucination cannot reliably conceal information. A population subjected to sustained sleep disruption over time becomes, by increments, easier to manipulate, easier to control, more susceptible to suggestion, and less capable of organized resistance. These are not hypotheses. They are documented conclusions from research programs conducted on both sides of the Iron Curtain, some of which were eventually made public, and some of which were not. The Soviet program most relevant to this story was not the fictional gas chamber. It was a series of experiments conducted under the auspices of the Institute of Experimental Medicine in Leningrad, beginning in the late 1950s and continuing in various forms into the 1970s. The subjects were not always volunteers in any meaningful sense of the word. The research included sustained sleep deprivation combined with pharmacological agents, not a fictional stimulant gas, but real compounds including amphetamine derivatives and early antipsychotic medications used in ways their designers had not intended. The goal was not to see how long a person could be kept awake. The goal was to understand how the mind collapsed under sustained assault and whether that collapse could be directed, managed, or reversed. The researcher who oversaw the most significant portion of this work was a man whose name appears in partial declassification documents from the early 2000s. He was not a monster in any theatrical sense. He was a scientist who believed, as many scientists have believed in many countries, that the strategic value of his work justified its methods. He kept precise records. He noted the progression of symptoms in his subjects, with the same clinical detachment he would have applied to any other experiment. His notes describe, in the dry language of institutional science, a series of human beings moving through the stages of extreme sleep deprivation, the irritability of the first day, the cognitive deterioration of the second, the perceptual disintegration of the third, and beyond the third day, a territory that his notes describe, with striking understatement, as involving significant departure from baseline psychological function. What happened to the subjects after the experiments concluded is not fully documented. Some were returned to the prisoner population from which they had been drawn. Some were not. The researchers' notes end at the conclusion of each experimental phase and do not follow the subjects beyond the laboratory door. This is, in its own way, more disturbing than any fictional account, not because of what it describes, but because of the gap it leaves. The fiction tells you everything, in detail, with the generous completeness of a story designed to be consumed. The archive gives you a partial record and a closed door and leaves you to understand, without being told directly, what closing a door on a human being means. The modern researcher who spent 3 years attempting to compile a full account of the Institute's sleep deprivation program described the experience of working in the partial archive as follows. Every document she found confirmed that the program existed, and that it produced results that were considered significant enough to continue. Every document ended before the question she most needed to answer. She found the methodology. She found the pharmacological protocols. She found the summary conclusions, stripped of individual case detail, noting that the research had advanced the state's understanding of psychological resilience thresholds by a meaningful margin. She did not find the names of the subjects. She did not find what happened to them. The archive, she noted, was complete enough to prove the program existed, and incomplete enough to ensure that no individual could be held accountable for any specific act within it. This is the distance between the fiction and the fact. The fictional Soviet sleep experiment gives its victims names, faces, final words. It gives them a drama proportionate to what was done to them. The real program gives its victims anonymity, bureaucratic notation, and a closed door. The fiction is more humane, in a strange sense. It at least insists that what happened to these people was significant enough to be remembered in detail. The story that spread across the internet in 2010 was a lie. The thing it was lying about was real. This is, perhaps, why it persisted, not because people could not tell the difference between fiction and history, but because some part of them understood, correctly, that the difference in this case was a matter of documentation rather than substance. The Soviet state did keep people awake against their will, in sealed rooms, in the service of research that served the state's interests and not theirs. It simply did not do it with a gas. It did it with the ordinary instruments of institutional power, authority, captivity, pharmacology, and a filing system designed to record conclusions without preserving the humanity of the people from whom those conclusions were extracted. The room with no windows is real. It just does not look the way the story said it did.